Most people are familiar with Skinwalker Ranch and the strange occurrences that have been reported to have happened there. But not far away, some miles to the south, in the Valley of the Sun, Arizona, lies another strange ranch. From being a young boy, John Edmonds had always wanted a ranch of his own. He loved animals and had a dream of rescuing canines and horses to give them a better life on his property. So, in 1995, he and his wife, Joyce Edmonds, bought a ranch of their own, hoping for a nice peaceful life together where they would operate their Hopeful Hooves Rescue Centre and live in the country. Prior to settling at Stardust Ranch, John had been a psychiatric therapist, but by this time was now a full-time rancher trying to make his dream project a reality. Joyce, on the other hand, was an FBI employee and worked at the office in Phoenix. The couple did achieve their dream, housing 8 rescued Rottweilers and around 24 horses that were in need of help. The rescue centre had been a success, and there they held therapy sessions so that disabled young people and those with mental health problems could come to the ranch for that kind of care, and everything was going well. At least, that was the case for a while, but this ranch would become a living nightmare for the family. Back in 1995, when the Edmonds first purchased the property, upon arriving for the first time, they noticed that a lot of the previous owner's belongings had just been left inside the home, as if they had left the ranch in a hurry. John didn't really think much of this and thought there'd been a mistake, so he called the realtor to voice his complaint and basically asked what the deal was. The realtor got in contact with the previous owners, and for one reason or another, they just didn't seem to get that they had to move their things out of the house. Though eventually he was able to convince them and then told John that they were going to come back and pick up their belongings. To avoid any awkwardness, I assume, John headed to the nearby town to have something for lunch, and the hope was that once he came back, they'd be done and out of his hair. So, John left for the town to give the previous owners some time to remove their things. On that day, Joyce was working at the Phoenix FBI office, so John went alone. He spent 3 hours in the little town and returned to a very unusual sight. John knew that 3 hours was probably not enough time to remove the sheer amount of things that they'd left behind, but once he got home, everything was gone. Great, he thought, they must have got out in a hurry. However, he then noticed the swimming pool. All of the belongings that were previously inside the house, including the appliances, had just been thrown and abandoned at the bottom of the swimming pool outside. John, now confused and angry, then called the realtor again to explain that is not what he had in mind, and that the previous owners were supposed to take their things with them. The realtor was also taken aback by this, and this time came out to the property personally, saw the mess, and then made another call. He then explained to John that the other family stated that when they arrived at the ranch, they found all of their things had been thrown in the pool and assumed that John had angrily thrown them away, and now they were refusing to retrieve them. John said to the realtor, "Why on earth would I do that?" and asked if he could get them to come back. They were never able to contact the family again, and John must have felt as though he'd been absolutely scammed, and that this family just didn't want to deal with their belongings and so trashed the pool with them. It took John the entire weekend to clear the mess in the pool, but afterwards they'd finally moved in. On the Monday, John was stood in the kitchen still unpacking and putting things away when he noticed a man walking towards the driveway. John described this man as looking like an old veteran of the military. He was holding a blade and was now on the property. John went outside with means of defending himself, though concealed, because he assumed there was about to be an altercation or an incident. Now outside and getting a better look at the stranger, John said that he was very dishevelled looking, didn't have a shirt on, and looked as though he'd spent far too much time out in the sun. John greeted him cordially and said, "Good afternoon, is there something I can help you with?" The man looked at John in bemusement and asked what he was doing there. John told him that he and Joyce had just purchased the property, and the man replied, mentioning the previous owners by name, saying that they were the ones that lived there and that he protects their property. John, for the second time in just a matter of days, was deeply confused again and didn't really know how to respond to that. So he told the man, "Well sir, I'm sorry to tell you this, but they're gone. They don't live here anymore." The man then pointed towards the back of the property, towards the now tack room. in which John had been storing the saddles for the horses. The man told John, "That's where I live." John explained again that the property belongs to him now and he didn't want anyone else staying at the ranch. He didn't require the stranger's services or anything else and then asked him to leave. The man stared directly at John and replied, "You know, you're going to wish I was here. You're going to be sorry." John thought that this was a direct threat and asked what he'll be sorry about. The man replied, "There's monsters on this property and I get rid of them." John thought this guy was an absolute nutcase or was under the influence as he watched him walk away. He assumed that the previous owners let this guy stay on the property because they were either intimidated by him or felt sorry for him or something like that. At this point, John was in a bit of a panic because he had no idea if this man was going to return and do something crazy or cause an altercation. Joyce didn't even want to move out to Stardust Ranch in the first place and was completely against the move. But John wanted to follow his dream and didn't realise there was going to be problems like this, especially right off the bat. I suppose thankfully, Joyce did work for the FBI, so they were always going to have law enforcement support if something did go awry. Though I get the sense that John really didn't want to tell Joyce about this incident and put her off the move even more than she already was. In any case, the stranger never returned to the ranch, but things did go awry in other bizarre and unexpected ways. The specific time period isn't clear, though it wasn't long after moving in when John and Joyce had gone on a date evening together in Phoenix, where they'd gone to see a movie at the cinema. On the way home, while driving up onto the ranch, the pair of them stated that they'd seen unusual orbs of light bobbing around in the sky to the south of the property. John recalled that they had no idea what they were looking at, but they were fascinated by these things moving around in the sky. The couple did know that there was an Air Force base nearby, and reasoned that might have been something to do with it, though they also stated that they appeared to be much faster than planes and weren't making a noise. Their description detailed that these things were orange in colour, they would dance around in the sky, disappearing and reappearing. 3 months into living at the property, and Joyce was still feeling very negative about the whole move there, and she also noticed that John hadn't been himself and seemed to be getting worse. She described that he was becoming more irritable and tense than usual. John would complain that some of his belongings would just disappear or be misplaced around the property randomly. Joyce didn't take this too seriously and thought that John must have just been under a lot of stress while getting the ranch sorted, and was just being a bit forgetful. But John felt like something out of the ordinary was happening, and his complaints only worsened. While Joyce would be out at work, he'd explain that electrical devices around the property would just stop working all of a sudden, and he couldn't determine a cause for what was happening. He said that these devices would just start working again sometime later at random. John had electrical tests done, and everything was coming back fine, but these incidents would repeat. Then Joyce experienced this for herself too. The pair of them were ready to settle down and sleep for the night, but while in bed, the TV turned itself on, and then shortly afterwards the radio too. Around this time, and similar to John's mood, Joyce said that the horses and dogs were becoming more tense and seemed to be uneasy a lot of the time. The pair of them said that they didn't have a great explanation for the weirdness that was going on around the ranch, and started to wonder if they had a gas leak and had been inhaling carbon monoxide, which was causing them to hallucinate and experience these things. After testing for that though, similar to the electrical tests, the gas safety checks passed too. During this time in 1995, a time before everyone had a mobile phone glued to their hands, John needed to get a phone line installed, so he rang the local phone company and inquired about it. They told him they could do it, except they didn't arrive on 2 separate occasions after agreeing a time and date with John. John then filed a complaint and was promised that the installation crew would arrive. According to John, the worker did arrive on this 3rd attempt, but he seemed quite apprehensive about getting out of the truck. At the time, the Rottweilers were barking quite loudly from the house, so John reassured him that the dogs were inside and wouldn't be a problem. This man then told John it wasn't the dogs he was afraid of. John looked at the man and asked what he meant, to which the man said, "Don't you know about your house?" While things had been odd, John jokingly said, "Sure, it's big, beautiful, and in the middle of nowhere." The man, according to John, being completely serious, told him that he'd heard strange stories about the ranch, and that it had a bit of a dark past. He said that the original owner and builder of the home purchased the land as a surprise for his wife. However, when he brought her to it, she said that she felt a dark presence on the property and refused to move in. It's difficult to describe this next bit properly on YouTube, but I'll give it a go. Later owners were said to have lost their son on the property, and they were never able to understand why he'd made the decision to step away from life. After that incident, the parents could no longer remain at the ranch and sold it on to the next owners. According to John, it wasn't long after getting the phone lines installed where things took a turn, and now he realised that something was seriously wrong at the ranch. So let's get bizarre. As previously mentioned, John had 8 Rottweilers, and like every other day, he went to feed them in the morning, but realised that one of them was missing, which was odd because they were enclosed overnight and shouldn't have been able to get out. John walked around for a while trying to figure out where the dog might have gone, and then he found the remains on the property. Though, according to John, the scene was far more bizarre and confusing as he couldn't figure out what had happened to cause this. He said that it appeared as though the remains had been flattened by a steamroller or something like that. When John came across the scene, he said that he was just in shock and wasn't really able to take in any of the details past that, and he had to go sit down, probably to just prepare himself mentally. When he came back, he started to analyse what exactly had happened. Firstly, and again, he didn't know how the dog had gotten out in the first place, but then he noticed that the ground around the flattened remains were completely dry and there were no fluids surrounding it. None of the other dogs had been barking that night, as John said that they would have heard that and woken up. So someone either removed the dog from the sleeping area, or John had missed one as he was putting them to rest for the night. But either way, he said that he had no idea what kind of incident took place that would have resulted in that outcome. John looks to be a man with a big heart, and he said that this really affected him and was the incident that changed everything. He began to suspect and believe that someone, or something I suppose, was actively trying to ruin their lives and their animals' lives at the ranch. This wouldn't be the only time he noticed something unusual happening with the animals. When caring for the horses, he noticed that some of them had unusual marks on them as if they'd come into contact with a sharp object. Interestingly, when this would occur, he didn't believe that it was a person doing this, but additionally said that he couldn't find any evidence of attempted animal predation. He also stated that he never once heard the animals react to anything that might have been causing this during the night. But then, according to John, whatever was happening to the horses also began happening to him and Joyce. The pair of them have reported waking up in the morning on numerous occasions to find similar fresh marks and burns on their person with no recollection as to what happened. In the midst of this, the Edmonds reportedly began to see more hovering lights in the distance, and they began to feel that the situations with the marks to the animals and themselves were somehow related to these lights. On several occasions, they had said that they'd seen lights on their property that were lower to the ground. Numerous times, John believed that people were on his ranch with flashlights and they were either trying to camp there or do something else. So he went outside to confront these people, only to state that the lights would rapidly zoom away from him. Sometimes speeding off along the ground and other times going straight up towards the sky. John was baffled and had no idea what was going on, while Joyce said that she was becoming scared of whatever was happening because she didn't believe it was natural. Joyce wanted to sell the property, but John didn't want to give up on his dream and was quoted as saying, "This is my ranch and I won't be chased off by these lights." They kept silent about these occurrences as they understood the stigma of being associated with seeing unusual things in the sky, though that kind of stigma has eased somewhat in recent times, especially with news segments coming from reliable places seeming to assert that there may be something happening that we're not familiar with. However, John's silence broke when things took another dark turn. The incidents with the animals had escalated, and now he started to find various remains on his property. These carcasses, though not described as being flattened like one of the dogs had been, he still stated that there were no fluids on the ground around them. Additionally, he stated the removal of organs had also taken place, such as eyes and the tongue, though he also held a belief that internal ones had also been taken. He would go on to state that there were no obvious signs of animal predation, in the sense that there were no claw marks or bite marks, but rather, he said, the removal seemed to have been precise somehow. That reminds me of the kind of descriptions given by farmers and ranchers in America in the 60s, 70s and 80s. Local authorities and the FBI also in some cases didn't understand what was going on exactly, so started to suspect cultists were performing rituals or doing this to animals for some other purpose. This still comes up today too from time to time, and interestingly, I don't believe there has ever been an eyewitness account to this kind of crime taking place. A more recent incident of this nature was reported in 2022 in Alaska. For the sake of YouTube, I'll have to spare the details, but in this article, the rancher stated that he cares for 300 cows, and 2 of them had vanished. They were found accidentally by 2 8-year-old girls, and similar to the way John was describing the findings at Stardust Ranch, and similar happenings at Skinwalker Ranch for that matter, the Alaskan rancher basically stated that parts of the cows were missing, and they have a butcher shop and they understand well enough the difference between animal predation and something more purposeful and precise. A few years ago now actually, I made a deep dive on this topic, looking at older cases of this happening for Patreon, since I couldn't put it on YouTube, which you can find a link to in the description below. In any case, whether there is a mundane explanation or not, it truly is a particularly bizarre and fascinating topic. While John did believe that something extraordinary was taking place at the ranch in general, at first he did try to find a more ordinary explanation of what was happening. He pointed out that in some cases he wouldn't find any remains, but he'd just be a horse down and had no idea how it vanished or how it would have gotten out in the first place. Similar to the Rottweiler, I suppose. According to John, this search for a mundane explanation came to an end when walking to his horses one morning and noticed some of the heavy metal fence panels weighing around 100 pounds were, and I quote, bent like pretzels. John said he had absolutely no idea what could have done this. He called the livestock board and they were baffled too, offering no explanation except to say that it wasn't a coyote or anything like that, which is probably among the least helpful things I've ever heard in my life. Some time had passed, and now John started to experience an eerie or paranoid feeling around the house that someone was watching him and Joyce. He said that he couldn't quite explain it, but that it was discomforting and he tried to keep it a secret because he didn't want to freak Joyce out. It got so bad that he didn't even want to shower because it just felt like he wasn't alone. We've gone over some weirdness already, but it's at this point where things really go from 0 to 60. And I'd also like to ask if you've ever heard about this before, and if you knew Skinwalker Ranch had a neighbour like this. One night they went to bed, but Joyce was snoring, which kept John awake. As he laid there, a familiar feeling of not being alone crept over him. He said that 3 shadows slowly moved around the room, which filled him with dread and left him feeling paralysed. Remembering the baseball bat he kept by his bed, John managed to regain his composure and reached for it. To his horror, he felt something cold and damp lightly tapping against his outstretched arm. Grabbing the bat with one hand, he used the other to seize whatever was touching him. John leapt out of bed and struck what he said was a grey-coloured entity multiple times with the bat. After the 3rd strike, the thing, whatever it was, and the other 2 shadows vanished. Shaken, John dropped the bat, woke Joyce and exclaimed that he knew what was happening to the horses. John described this thing as having large, bulbous eyes and stood around 4 feet tall. He explained that as he struck it with the bat, it made a hissing sound, and then in the panic afterwards in the darkness, he could no longer see it and wasn't sure where it went or how it left. According to John, the encounters with the grey-coloured entities did not end with this initial incident. In fact, if anything, their visits became more frequent. Both John and Joyce began to see the small grey entities with large heads, skinny limbs and black bulging eyes. They often saw them briefly at night in their bedroom and during the day on the ranch. John started to conceal carry at all times and said that he'd used it as a warning numerous times to fend them off. The increasing visits and John's desperate attempts to defend against them strained his relationship with Joyce, leading them to sleep in separate bedrooms. John just did not want to leave the ranch, and Joyce was worried that she was going to get accidentally hit while the confrontations were taking place. It was these beings that John believed were responsible for the marks he and Joyce had experienced and the things that had happened to their animals. During one alleged encounter, he confronted them asking, "What are you doing on my ranch? Why are you entering my house? Why are you trying to harm us and our animals?" He never received an answer, but according to John, whatever was happening at the ranch, the aggression continued towards them and the animals. The Edmonds were said to have been visited by these entities up to 3 times a week, always in groups of 3. Convinced the bat was not enough of a deterrent, he decided to replace the bat with a sword. One evening at around 6 PM, as darkness was setting in, John headed towards the kitchen and recalled that there were 3 of these things inside his home. His Rottweilers had noticed them too and began barking and charging at them. John said that he struck one of them with the sword and retrieved some tissue before all three of them vanished. Unsure of what to do next, John placed the fleshy tissue inside a glass jar and stored it in the freezer. He observed that it emitted a liquid resembling a brake fluid and seemed to be highly acidic. At the time, John had taken on a producer role for a radio station and worked alongside host Kevin Smith. Kevin put John in contact with Captain Robert Collins of the US Air Force. John asked Robert something along the lines of, "If you ever found remains not of this earth, what would you do with it?" When Robert inquired if John had something like that, John revealed that he believed he had part of one. Robert then connected John with biophysicist Dr. Levengood, who despite initial skepticism showed great interest in John's claim. John sent the tissue sample to Dr. Levengood, who promised to study it. Around 3 months later, apparently, an excited Dr. Levengood contacted John proclaiming, "You have the smoking gun. You have absolute proof of visitation on Earth." Initially, Levengood reported that the samples contained tiny segmented fibres resembling grass, which was highly unusual. He also explained that blood typically does not contain these segments, and the samples were almost pure hemoglobin. This is exactly what John wrote in his book, published in 2020. However, in 2016, John featured in a Ghost Adventures episode and stated that the samples contain chlorophyll, not hemoglobin, as previously stated by Levengood. So I'm not sure why the change of information or discrepancy. Now, this is where things took another bizarre turn. According to John, Dr. Levengood suddenly cut all contact with the Edmonds and he wasn't able to get in contact with him again. John later discovered that Dr. Levengood had passed away on the 28th of September 2013, aged 88, reportedly from head injuries sustained after tripping and falling in his lab. Additionally, John said that the samples had gone missing. And to add to the situation, Dr. Levengood's wife passed away a couple of weeks later. Some time after Dr. Levengood passed away, apparently John and a friend of his were outside the ranch when a black SUV suddenly pulled up to the property. Two men wearing black suits got out and approached the gate. The gate was 7 feet tall and locked, but instead of waiting for John to open it, the men, apparently, simply walked, or phased, right through it. John and his friend, now frightened, jumped up and backed away. John speculated and thought that the men might be officials trying to intimidate him with technology that is not understood by the public. The men stopped about 10 feet away from John. John demanded, "Who are you guys? Can I see some ID? You're trespassing here." The men looked at him and demanded that he stop talking about the craft he'd seen. Trying to appear unafraid, John repeated his request for ID. The men ignored him, turned around, walked back through the closed gate and left in their SUV. John noted that the men looked strange and unnatural. They wore black glasses and were extremely pale is the description he gave. The craft that John would speak of was said to be metallic. He estimated around 100 feet in diameter and allegedly would hover over the ranch. At this point, John stated that he feared for his safety, which is what prompted him to go public, and he appeared on various radio shows like Coast to Coast to tell his story. He believed that by sharing his experiences openly, it would raise suspicions if anything were to happen to him. In contrast, Joyce preferred to stay out of the spotlight and expressed her desire for privacy, refusing to participate in interviews. Throughout their time at the ranch, the Edmonds reported numerous incidents of harassment where they felt paralysed and unable to move or scream. Joyce experienced this phenomenon more frequently than John. John believes he had been marked by these beings. He described feeling a sudden, intense pain and crushing pressure, followed by an indentation in his left leg without any warning. They both woke up with unexplained puncture wounds on their skin and often discovered bruises on their inner thighs, abdomen and chest. Both have reported triangular depressions in their skin and have experienced skin disfigurement, which was described as being similar to radiation exposure. The Edmonds also reported several instances of missing time and they fear they may have been taken on those occasions. According to John, Joyce has reportedly levitated on multiple occasions overnight. The first night this happened, John attempted to wake her by calling her name, but she remained asleep and in the air. The levitation stopped only when John placed his hands on her shoulders and called out loudly. Joyce then opened her eyes, abruptly landed back on the bed, and promptly fell asleep again. The following morning, she reportedly had no memory of the event of the previous night. Every night that this would occur, Joyce would have no recollection of levitating the night before. During one incident, John observed her being levitated and moving, or phasing, through the wall, exiting the house. John tried pulling on her ankles to bring her back, but this didn't work, deciding instead to walk alongside her body, following the force pulling Joyce away from the house. Once outside the house, John saw what was pulling his wife, a metallic object, approximately 100 feet in diameter, hovering 100 feet above the ground, was his description. It emanated a bright blue-white light from its underside. Not willing to stand by, John fired in the direction of the craft, which resulted in her release. Joyce dropped to the ground and woke up immediately, this time strangely able to recall everything. These encounters are extraordinary and very difficult to believe, but the Edmonds insist that everything they've reported is true. Incidents would continue to occur on the ranch, with the Edmonds frequently claiming to have been visited by men wearing dark suits, seemingly just observing them. Around 2010 and 2011, Robert Bigelow contacted John, wanting to send investigators out to the ranch, and John agreed, with the understanding that anything to shed some light on what was happening was welcomed. Given his reputation in this area, Bigelow seemed like the right person for the job. Although Bigelow never personally visited the ranch, John communicated numerous times over the phone with him. 2 vehicles were dispatched by Bigelow from Las Vegas. However, only one arrived, the one without the investigation equipment. The other vehicle, which contained all the necessary equipment to investigate, never made it to the ranch. Despite various attempts, it just couldn't reach the location for some reason. Another vehicle was sent to transport the equipment, but that one also broke down. Eventually, the vans with all the equipment had to be towed back to Las Vegas. The vehicle that did arrive brought the investigators, a video camera and a polygraph machine. The investigators interviewed John and Joyce, filmed some footage, and this continued intermittently for several days. They spent a few hours here and there, and between visits, Bigelow and his investigators would call John to ask a barrage of questions, often repeating the same questions. When the investigators left, they told John they would provide him with results or a copy of their report after they reviewed everything. However, John never received anything or heard anything from Bigelow again. So, let's be honest, there's plenty of things to be skeptical about here, which given that they didn't hear back from Bigelow, he likely must have been too. You'd think that if all of this was truly going on, then there'd be some evidence, anything really other than the testimony of one man. No pictures or video evidence or anything like that. Secondly, John had made the claim that he downed some of these grey entities, but there's no evidence of that either. John doesn't have a great explanation for that, suggesting that the bodies just inexplicably went missing, similar to other objects on the ranch. The only supposed evidence was the tissue with Dr. Levengood, that nobody but the pair of them ever got to see. As previously mentioned, Levengood stated that the samples contained tiny segmented grass-like fibres, which he found to be unusual. Over the phone, he apparently told John that he wasn't going to publish a formal report and he wasn't going to send the samples for DNA testing because it was too expensive. Which is incredibly dubious if the claim here is that Dr. Levengood thought that this was undeniable evidence of something weird. So that hardly seems likely. There's also Dr. Levengood's passing, which did occur on the 28th of September 2013 at the old age of 88. John claims he passed away in his lab due to a head injury, but other sources stated that he passed away in a hospice. There's also something incredibly funny about the idea that you could fend off entities that are supposed to be advanced beings or something with a baseball bat. John claims to have had battles with 19 of these entities. Even after the first time, you'd think that you'd just be out of there, there'd have been a me-shaped hole in the front door. Why would you make the decision to fight things that can just disappear and reappear at will and then do that 18 more times? John talks about how he used various means of defending his property against them, such as using nunchucks. It's all just incredibly wild stuff. It's like claiming to be harassed by advanced beings from somewhere else beyond anything we understand, and their only weakness is a baseball bat and some nunchucks. There's so much of this that screams there's no way that happened, or he was just hallucinating or something like that. The thing that separates Skinwalker Ranch from Stardust Ranch is the fact that with Skinwalker Ranch, whether you believe what was happening there was real, fake, or somewhere in between, there genuinely was a lot of money pumped into that place. There was interest from the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, military personnel, Senator Harry Reid, among others. Whereas with this one, there just isn't any of that. In fact, the only person who seemed to show any interest was Robert Bigelow, before he did an immediate 180 and walked away from the ranch. There's only speculations of course, and we'll never truly know what happened there between the two parties. There is speculation that perhaps it could have been thought that by exaggerating the claims, or trying to be like Skinwalker Ranch, it might inflate the price of other ranches or something like that. Though I don't like to attribute malice to people without evidence, so obviously I'm not sure. So what's the deal then? Did John just make up the entire thing? What reason could he have had for doing that? Again, I'm not in the business of calling people liars without absolute evidence. It's also not usually the case that people just outright lie like this for no reason. It really could be instead that John truly believed that these things were happening and that this is just his reality. It's not completely unheard of after all. There are people who experience intense paranoia and believe they're being targeted by someone or something. They're not lying to you when they share this information, they truly believe it. That's the reality they truly believe they're living, even if it's based on a flawed or perhaps non-existent premise. Of course, I'm not saying that John was paranoid or anything like that, that's not for me to say. It strikes me as though that John really does believe the things he said that he'd experienced. In an interview with a woman named Kerry Cassidy, actually around the same time he started to talk about the nunchucks in the conversation, he expressed that he'd sustained a severe head injury in 1973 and had some long-term damage to his skull, which may have affected his fear response. It's not specified what the injury was specifically or how he got it. It wasn't stated if he had experienced hallucinations or anything weird in between the time period of sustaining the injury and purchasing the ranch. If there was an underlying injury there, I wonder if the stress of the move, financial stress if there was any, and everything else got to him. Though I don't want to speculate too much on that. I'd also point out that if you'd seen a loved one literally hovering in the air and being pulled through a wall somehow, it seems to me that first, you might decide not to stay there anymore. Or you'd set up cameras or something. A lot of this is just beyond credulity, and generally speaking, I'm someone that's quite open to these kind of things. I don't believe that we know everything about everything after all. Anyway, I'll leave it there and hand it over to you in the comments below. What do you think about all this? I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. Please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and do drop me a comment as I read pretty much all of them. I hope that you've had a great day, or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.